Good to see you, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Nice to see you. Beth, good to see you. And Zella, nice to see you. It's been a while. I'm glad you're able to join us. Viva, good morning. And I see you have some attendees. So good morning to everyone else who is with us. Hi, Sharon and Shira, Kathy, Jerry, and MK, Eyal. Good morning, everybody. Rumel, nice to see you. Okay, good morning. So before we jump in, just to note that this come in a couple of weeks, Drisha's annual Winter Zman will launch. The Zman will be held via Zoom and will be during the week of December 26th. You'll receive an email shortly. We already put out a save the date on Facebook, but just wanted to note I'm excited about this program. Hi, Jerry. Good to see you. Hello. Just wanted to note that you'll receive a notification about the program, but we're focusing on focus. I mentioned this last week, I think, focusing on focus this year. The world is so busy. It's really hard to focus. It's busier and harder to focus, I think, more than ever due to things like, social media and such. And I think looks like Sherry wants to be promoted to panelist, but I'm not quite sure how to do that. So we'll work on that, Sherry. So we're focusing on, as I said, focus on the notion of kavanah. Kavanah could be translated as intention, intentionality, or focus, maybe presence or direction. Hey, Sherry, there you are. Nice to see you. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the notion of kavanah b'mitzvot. Mitzvah performance can be a place in our lives in which we can both focus and have intention and practice having focus and intention. But it's not necessarily the case. One can perform mitzvah without kavanah, if you will. And one example, I mentioned this last week, one example of a mitzvah which can interface with kavanah in really interesting ways is prayer, of course, is tefillah. In certain ways, that's the classic example of a mitzvah which might demand actually kavanah in order to constitute a mitzvah. Maimonides famously argues, or he writes, that a tefillah without kavanah is actually not a tefillah at all. And it's actually more complicated than that within Maimonides' corpus himself. But tefillah is a prime example. So what we're going to do is my colleague, Dr. Shana Strout-Schick, who's a wonderful Talmudist and teacher of Talmud, will be leading morning seder around the core sugyot of kavanah b'mitzvot. That's from Tractate Rosh Hashanah. So for those of you who've been learning Talmud with us or have been itching for an opportunity to learn Talmud, here's a wonderful opportunity with a fabulous teacher. 4 mornings, December 26th through 29th. And then we have 3 afternoon sessions, again, all on Zoom, and you can come, they can be standalone, but as a unit, I hope that they will be even more generative. 3 sessions, which we're hoping to expose people to practices designed or which can be used to cultivate kavanah in davening, in tefillah practices. And actually some of them are by practitioners. So the first, the 26th will be with Rabbi Roli Madelon from BJ, who is just an amazing person, an amazing davener, an amazing cultivator of kavanah himself. And he's going to share, I hope, some of the practices that he himself practices and leads his community in practicing to enter into kavanah when praying, especially piyutim. That's one of his areas of expertise, especially the use of piyutim, of liturgical poetry, to enter into prayer. That'll be Monday the 26th. The next day, I have the great privilege of sort of co-facilitating a session with Dr. Devorah Steinmetz on the use of the imagination in prayer. She has her own teachings on that, but I have worked a bit on the teachings of the Piasetzner Rebbe, and one of the things that he did was develop visualizations, not only in prayer but in other contexts that people might engage in order to recruit the imagination into religious life more intentionally. maybe I'll leave it at that, but you could, join us if you want to learn more about the possibilities of maybe the requirement of the use of imagination in Kulta and Kavanah and Tefillah. And then on Wednesday, the 28th of December, there is a scholar, a musicologist, an ethnomusicologist who actually lives nearby me here, named Dr. Matan Mugoda. He is an expert in Hasidic nigunim, and he is going to treat us to and expose us to specifically, like it's a curated exposure to specific nigunim designed, which are employed by different Hasidic groups to enter into Kavanah. Some Kavanah experiences around actually learning. Chabad has a specific tune they use when they when the Rebbe gives a teaching, gives a maimar, a ma'amar. In Breslov, there's something when they hear specific stories or Nachum Breslov, but also tunes which are designed to cultivate devekut, some sort of cleaning or something which is a term somewhat I guess adjacent to Kavanah in certain respects. In any event, those are 3 afternoons the week of December 26, 27, 28, on the morning of 29th, and you'll receive emails about this, I hope, today. There's already some information on Facebook. Anyway, I'd love to see you there. I think it'd be terrific to come for all of it, come for some of it, and bring your friends. Okay, now that was our public service announcement. Now, with regards to the Haftorah, so I mentioned last week that the Ashkenazim read Hosea for both last week and this week's Haftorot, right? Last week they actually read, parts of chapter 12 into 13 and 14, and then this week they actually go back a little bit to chapter 11 of Hosea. I think they do that because I'll show you when we get to the text itself, but it has to do with which parts of the Haftorah reference which parts of the Jacob story, and sort of aligning that to Parashah, you end up reading backwards, which is funny. Sephardim, which as I also mentioned, they read part of Hosea last week, and then this week they have a different Haftorah from Ovadia. And again, as I tried to say, I know some of you are joining this weekly Shiur not only to learn the Haftorah of the week and to think about its relation to the Parashah, but also just to learn more Tanakh. So I just mentioned that in case you want to learn Ovadia. Ovadia is a short little prophetic work. It's rather harsh. It directs itself towards Edom, and it's rather harsh. So it's not exactly a feel-good book, but it is a short one, and it's, what can I say? It's one of the prophets. So if you're looking to learn more Tanakh and you find yourself with a spare 45 to 60 minutes and you just want to sort of peruse it, that's what the Sephardim will be doing. Or go to a Sephardic shul this Shabbat and hear that Haftorah. But in regards to Hosea, what I'd like to do is, and I'm going to share a screen in just a moment, is since we spent a bit of time last week on Hosea, the first of the Trei Asar, the first of the 12 so-called minor prophets, we spoke a bit about an introduction to Hosea generally and situated Hosea, and we spoke a bit about how the text of Hosea, especially those chapters, relate to the Jacob story. So I want to continue that today with 2 specific foci. Okay, number one, I wanted to take a look at the way this week's Haftorah speaks about exile and return from exile, in a way speaks about death and return from death. Okay, so that's one focus, and I'll tell you more about that. Have past classes been recorded? I believe they have, and I believe they're all on Facebook. I don't know if they're up on YouTube yet, but in any event. And then I want to speak about or learn with you a really interesting text from the Talmud, actually, the Talmud in Chulin, which has a passage which actually cites our Haftorah this week in its discussion and meditation upon not only Jacob and his figure, but the relationship of humanity and angels, and its relationship, that dynamic, and we'll sort of take a look at that and see what that can teach us about the Parsha and maybe even about ourselves. Okay, so that is our heavy agenda for the coming while. Let's begin. I'm going to share my screen right here, and we'll jump in. As always, by the way, I mentioned this last week, please do, pipe up with your own readings, questions, thoughts, pushbacks. The more interactive, the better. Okay, let's see if I got the right screen here. Okay, here we go. So Hosea. Can you guys see it, Zella? Can you see? Is this okay? Terrific. Okay, so Hosea 11. So the Haftorah for this week actually begins at verse 7 in Hosea 11. But I'll note that the chapter begins, Ki na'ar Yisrael. This is before the Haftorah proper, but just a little bit of context. Ki na'ar Yisrael v'ohavehu u'mitzrayim karati livni. Here they translate, I fell in love with Israel. I loved Israel when Israel was yet still a child. And since Egypt, karati livni. And since Egypt, I have called Israel my son, Israel my child. Already here, I'll skip right to the Torah in a second, but you see two themes that will resonate, will echo forward during the rest of our time today. One, the theme of love, and two, the theme of being called back from exile. Hosea in general employs love language, deploys love language, love between spouses, strife and love between spouses, representing the God-Israel relationship, but also here you see sort of the parent-child relationship. That's one. And two, Mimitzrayim karati livni, the notion that Israel, because of that love, Israel was called forth, right, from Egypt. Exile is the experience that Israel finds itself in, and yet they're called forth and from a place of love out of Egypt. With that, let's scroll down to a second to the Haftorah and do some close reading, paying attention to our foci. So, God loves Israel, Ephraim, as Israel is often called in Hosea, perhaps because he's from the northern kingdom of Israel. And yet, of course, what would a prophet be without a prophetic critique? Ami tiluim lemeshuvati. Ve'el al yikra'uhu yachad lo yuramim. But my people persist despite my love for them, despite my calling them out of exile, calling to them. They persist in, here they have defecting from me. And it's difficult language here, but the El Ali Grehu, when it's summoned to come up, it does not. They do not meet the call, right? They do not respond. Maybe it means come up to God or something along those lines. They don't come up to me. Eich etencha Ephraim amagencha Yisrael, and yet says God, even though my child, is not listening to me, is not heeding my call, and it's a call of love, nonetheless, God finds God's self unable to give up Ephraim, cannot surrender Israel. How can I make you like Adma, like Siburim? These are the cities surrounding Sodom and Amorah, who God did indeed, destroyed and abandoned in a sense. But God says, with you, I can't do that. I can't render you like them. And here you see, by the way, we'll get to this in a second, Hosea already referencing, parts of Genesis. I have had, here they have had a change of heart, right? My heart, which maybe had a moment of thinking of anger towards you, has flipped over. I can't leave you. All my tenderness is stirred. I will not act on my wrath, therefore I will not destroy Ephraim. Lo asech karanapi, lo ashuv l'shachet Ephraim. Ki el anochi v'lo ish, b'kirbecha kadosh. I remain in you, holy, the Holy One, they translate, in your midst. V'lo avo be'ir. I will not come in fury. This is a hard line to translate. Here they translate be'ir as if it's like the language of fury. Acharei Adonai yelchu ka'aryeh yishag. The Lord will roar like a lion. Ki hu yishag, for he has roared. V'yecherdu vanim miyam. And his children shall come fluttering out of the west. Yecherdu kitzipor miMitzrayim. They shall flutter from Egypt like a sparrow. Uchiyona me'eretz Ashur, like a dove, like doves from Assyria. V'hoshavtim al batehem no'am Adonai. And I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. So we have here the theme of love, of God, who is disappointed and has fury towards Israel, towards Ephraim, and yet finds God's self unable to relinquish them, unable to destroy them. And in many places here, I would argue, the prophet is evoking references to parallel, analogous experiences in Genesis and in Exodus, respectively. Because in Genesis and Exodus, certainly in Genesis, certainly in Exodus is, of course, all about, at least the first half is all about being in exile in the land of Egypt, and then being called out of exile, God saving people from exile, Yetziat Mitzrayim. And that whole dynamic continues in the second part of the book of Exodus. But Genesis as well is also, in a way, all about exile and return from exile. And even, I would say, about death and return from death. Now, where does exile actually start in the book of Genesis, and what's the import of that theme in the book? So, where's the first exile in the book?
Yaakov.
Eden.
Yaakov. Who said Yaakov? Is that Stella?
Yeah.
No, I said Eden.
Oh, Ruthie.
Stella says Eden. Ruthie. Okay, great. Says Yaakov. So terrific. So those are two. I think the first one, I would say in a way, Jacob, we mentioned last week, is really prime foreshadowing of the exile, as to say, the Egypt. Like we said, the Haggadah centers itself around Arami Oved Avi, right? My father was a wandering Aramean, but as the Haggadah says, as the Midrash has it, Lavan tried to destroy my father, and the Jacob story is very much a foreshadowing in many elements of the story of the Exodus to the exile to Egypt and the Exodus from there, and that's when we're going to get to our Parashah, right? When Jacob returns from his time in Lavan and comes back home, but also in Eden already, of course, that people are not in the land, but in the garden, and are exiled. So being sent forth from the garden. I think a really interesting question in general is, let me just note first of all that when they are exiled from the garden, they encounter life as we know it, right? So mortality and suffering and work and perhaps opportunities that new reality entails. But the exile is in a sense a existential feature of all of our lives, right? Because none of us are in Eden. So, one of the claims that the beginning of Genesis makes, and makes many claims, one of the claims that the opening chapters make is that the human being, wherever we find ourselves, is not where the human being started. So exile is, a condition that we are all born into. We're all born into the exilic state. None of us are in the garden. Now, can you get back to the garden? So that's a complicated story, which is not exactly for now. On the one hand, there's, angels with flaming swords blocking the way, and none of us can really conquer death. And on the other hand, there might be another hand. Okay, so that's for another time. Okay, but the exilic state is indeed, fundamental to what it means to be a human being. And who else goes into exile? Well, Abraham, of course, not only leaves his homeland, but he gets to the land itself. He finally gets to this, El Haaretz Asher Areka, and then Vayirav Ba'aretz, there's a famine, and he has to go down to, of all places, Egypt. And that's also becomes, in a way, a mini exile and return. He goes down to Egypt. They're sort of suffering there, not in their own land, and returns with Rechush Gadol. Returns, a sort of a new person. He and his clan with great wealth, which we hear about in the promise of Brit Bein B'Tarim, right? They'll go down to this land which is not theirs, and they'll suffer, and then they'll be taken out, and they'll have great rechush, great bounty with them, and bring them up. So we have Abraham has that. As you said, Jacob, who's our the hero of our stories. So Jacob, of course, goes down goes up, I guess, into exile, into the land which is not his, and he literally serves there and serves hard there for many years, and suffers and is a stranger, but he also returns with the fourth generation, right, and with much rechush back into the land eventually. So he's able to come back, and he's even though Rivka doesn't call him back, but he eventually, right, he comes back to the land, and of course we'll talk about this in a little bit, but re-encounters angels there, has this experience with the Elohim, right, with the Ishimo, and goes back to Beit El, to the place of the stand-in for the temple, and there offer sacrifices. Joseph goes into exile again to Egypt, right, and goes down into the pit, and goes down to Egypt, goes down into the pit again, as to say, to the prison, eventually rises the ranks, and eventually returns in two senses. One, in that he returns to his father, but ultimately when he dies, he says, make sure that you bring my bones back with you, right? Pakod, pakad, make sure you bring back my bones with you when God redeems Israel from Egypt, because Joseph is, in a way, also the fourth generation, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So he's the fourth generation also, who goes down to exile and has to be brought back up. He has to come back up. So the book is all about, in a way, one of the major motifs is the notion of exile and what transpires under exile, and then the return, being called back from exile, the Geulah, so Galut and Geulah, right? The open question of, is there a way back into the garden, or is that door forever closed? And indeed, in our Haftorah, which we have in front of us here, we'll see that the prophet is referencing, I think, these stories, and sort of obliquely, but I would claim referencing these stories a bit in discussing Israel's state at the time, who is once again faced with the potential of exile, potential of being displaced, of destruction, but is being will be summoned back, has been summoned back due to the call of love. Just for example, first of all, explicitly, right, when we started with the beginning of the chapter before the Haftorah, Ki na'ar Yisrael b'ohavehu, u'mimitzrayim karati livni, you're already thinking about exodus from Egypt, right? They were in exile, and now we are going to call them back. Now we're going to call them back. The reference to the cities surrounding Sodom and Amorah as well bring our focus to the book of Genesis. I think even things like the verse here, Yechardu chitzipor mimitzrayim, that's explicitly about Egypt. Uchiyona me'eretz Ashur, even this one, Uchiyona, maybe I'm overreading here, but to my mind evokes the story of Noah, because Noah also, in a way, right, is a story of the destruction of the space, destruction of land, and then eventual return. Now that actually touches not only exile and return, but also, in a way, death and resurrection, which is a related motif, but not exactly the same, but also very much present in the book of Genesis, right? Because there you have, as we talked about a few weeks ago, about Isaac. So Isaac's not allowed to go to Egypt, but Isaac is certainly a figure who almost gets lost, almost dies, according to some midrashim, is actually slaughtered, and then is brought back, right? And then is miraculously saved and brought back, is resurrected. Joseph as well. Joseph is the figure who is almost lost and almost dies, and then is brought back and returned. And Noah, I think, right? Noah is somebody who represents humanity's almost utter distinction, right? Almost total oblivion. It's only saved through Noah, and it's the Yonah, Me'eretz Ashur. It's the Yonah which represents that hope and that possibility of return from that destruction. I mean, I actually think that is evoked here already. In two senses, those stories. Nehapach alai libi. Yachad Nichmaru Nichumi, because the Nehapach part is representative of God's, here it's God, changing back from wanting to destroy. But, when God destroys Sodom and Amorah, it's described as this overturning, right? Mahapecha, an overturning, an utter destruction, utter overturning of creation, perhaps. So that term evokes, again, this death and destruction narratives in Genesis. The libi thing, the B part, the idea of changing God's heart reminds us of God having changes of heart, God changing of heart when God decides, regrets having remade humanity to begin with, and leading to the building the Mabul itself, as well as God's change of heart, perhaps. Nichumi, the Nechama, when God decides, I will not destroy them anymore because they are but human. Indeed, Noach's name, Noach, Zeh Yenachamenu Mima'asenu, right? Noach is one who brings Nechama. And that is his role, and that is why he's the person who, represents the return from destruction, right? The one, and that's why he's also brought by the prophets, like Yeshaya on Parashah Noach, the Haftorah there, Kimei Noach Zot Li, because Noach represents Nechama, the possibility for consolation after destruction. So we see here these references, I think. We see here these references to the Genesis. They're a little bit subtle, but I think that there's these references to the Genesis stories of not only Jacob, but all the narratives of exile and return, and even, I would say, death and resurrection in a sense. And they are evoked and deployed by the prophet in this week's Haftorah to speak to Israel in his time, and to both critique them and raise the possibility of destruction, but also to reinforce the possibility, the hope, I'd say the precedent for comfort, for return from exile, and to return from near death. Now, what I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'll pause, look at the chat. So what does all this have to do with our Parashah? Well, everything, because Jacob is the one, like we say, who goes into exile, right, and then returns. Jacob is the one who, in a sense, right, faces the threat of death, and ultimately survives and thrives, despite, by the way, the complications of his figure. This is what the prophet says explicitly, right? Or depends on who you read it, but as we said, we tried to argue last week, says explicitly that Jacob is a complicated person, but eventually is brought back and embraced by God who calls back with love, because after all, how could God relinquish his child? Let me pause here and look at the chat. I think to do that, I have to stop share. So we have a lot of things here. Okay, great. So Sherry Haben Yakerli says, MK, indeed, Haben Yakerli Ephraim. Yeah, so later in the Haftorah, we'll see reference to them walking after me. Acharai Yelechu, they walk after me. Verse 10 there, Acharei Hashem Yelchu Ka'aryeh Yishag. Right, so that sounds to me exactly like Haben Yakerli Ephraim. Jacob, Ephraim is my dear beloved son. Deuteronomy, B'ni Bechori Israel. Israel is my firstborn child, but also the love language, right? Zacharti lachesed ne'orayach ahavat kelulotayach lechtech acharai b'ridbar. Walking after is seen as fealty and love. In contrast, Aviva says, in contrast to Adam and Eve, whose lives became harder when exiled from Eden, says Aviva, Abraham and Jacob thrived in returning from exile. Interesting, right? Good. Ruth says, is Hosea alluding to the prophet Yonah's visit to Nineveh? Where is Ruth here? There she is. I see your screen. I had the same thought. So thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure, but maybe, and maybe certainly that the prophet Yonah might be related to the story of Noach himself.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I elaborated on that point, that it had to do with a covenantal promise that they had with God that included gerut, inui, ve'avdut.
Yes, sorry that, yes. Perhaps when they thrived from returning from exile because of their covenantal relationship, the exile was part of the covenantal promise, right? Yes, and maybe in a way that helps them return, right? So they're sort of continuing the story of Adam and Eve, right? But they have, unlike Adam and Eve, they have this specific covenant which allows them to return. Excellent, thank you. And then we have, Aviva had another point, which is the repeated reference to exile is also reminiscent of the hero's journey. Yeah, Joseph Campbell, right? Getting lost in danger as part of the path to enlightenment. Yeah, I agree. And I think Jacob is a great example of that, and the hero has to always have this sort of struggle. And in part 2 of today, I want to talk about Jacob's specific struggle with that mysterious figure. Ayal has a hand up. Sherry also. So Ayal, Sherry has something. So Sherry, say something, and then if you're able to, please jump in. Yes, Sherry. Hi.
Yeah, well, I was touched by this. I've had a change of heart, and I was thinking, wouldn't it have been great if Yaakov had a change of heart when he met Esav, and had embraced his brother instead of just rejecting him and turning away again? Wouldn't that have been a totally different history? And I'm sorry that wasn't picked up by Yaakov to pattern himself after God to have a change of heart.
So I was thinking about if we would do Avadia today. I decided not to, but had we done Avadia, that would have opened up a whole thing, right? Along lines of what we were talking about, which is, Jacob and Esau. In the Chumash, are they reunited or are they not? Right? What happens? What happens with that kiss and that sort of departure? And what happens at the end of history? Right? Are they forever in 2 different places, separate? Is there ever a chance for reconciliation? So yes, I think that is a really interesting point. I want to also note that, and here, let me just share the screen again, that we talked most about Genesis right now, but there's also, I said earlier, there's also, I think, Exodus here. Go back to the screen share. And for example, a couple of things about where I see Exodus here, like this. Lo aseh charon api lo ashuv l'shachet Ephraim ki el anochi v'lo ish b'kirbecha kadosh. So b'kirbecha kadosh, evokes for me a couple of things, right? First of all, the notion that God is in your midst, right? V'shachanti b'tocham, excuse me, right? That God will dwell in the midst of Israel, and there'll be holiness, b'kerev machaneh, right? In your very machaneh. So that is the function of the Mishkan. But remember that was in doubt in the desert, right? Hayesh Hashem bikir beinu amayin, say the people. Is God bikir beinu? Is God not bikir beinu? Question a lot of people ask, right? Especially when they're wandering in the desert and they think that they've been redeemed and they're out of Egypt, and then they find themselves in a desert. Hayesh bikir beinu amayin. So God says, yes, indeed, I am bikir becha, and I'm in becha. Here they have the Holy One in your midst, but I'm sort of like, how should I say this? The locus of holiness in your midst. I am the representative. I am the Holy One in your midst. The Holy One meaning, of course, right, the Mikdash. So you have there, I think, sort of like language that we get from Exodus about God being in our midst, and the notion of holiness. But even things like Vayer Chardu Vanim Miyam, the idea of God roaring like a lion. Sometimes it sounds like God's pulling us out of exile because of the sort of tender call of the parent to the wayward child back from exile. Also, sometimes God sounds like this roaring lion. It's a different imagery of God. It sounds to me more like the Az Yashir God, Adonai Ishmo Chama, Adonai Shemo, Vayechadu Vanim Miyam. It's where my cursor is right here. When he roars, his children will come flooding out from the west. Yes, out of the west, because if you're sort of looking north in Israel, then the Great Sea is towards the Great Sea is towards the west. But Miyam may also be an oblique reference to the Yam Suf, right? That the children are sort of trembling as they come out of the sea, out of the Yam Suf, that is to say. So there as well, I think these are oblique references, but I think there as well, there's this evocation of the return from the exile from Egypt through the sea, and then at that point, Yechadu Chitzi Por Mitzrayim is explicit, and then the return from Egypt. and then return, to eventually the desert, but then eventually a return to the land. One more point about the Jacob references, and then I'll come back to Jacob proper and his fighting with the angel. Is that as you go into chapter 13, right? Here's Jacob striving with the angel. We're going to circle back to that in a minute. But as you go through here, God, right? I am God who took you out of Egypt. O shivcha v'halim kimei moed. Now here as well, you have Genesis and Exodus in one package, one powerful punch. Because God here says again, you have the threat of exile and you've been wayward and I'm critiquing you. But I'm the God who took you out of Egypt, and I will not only have taken you out of Egypt in the past, but I also will again. O shivcha v'ohalim kimei moed. And I think on one level, this is a reference again to Exodus, to the nothing other than the Ohel Moed, right? Not only the days of here they have days of old, but the tent, the tents of Moed, the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed. I'll return you to that sacred temple, to that tabernacle, to the Mishkan, to the Ohel Moed, the place of meeting. So I'll take you out of Egypt to the Ohel Moed. That's the book of Exodus in a nutshell, coming out of Egypt and building the Mishkan. But it's also maybe a reference to Jacob coming home, because when we first meet Jacob, we know about Esav, and Esav is this hunter, but Jacob is Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim. That's how he's characterized. He's an Ishtam. He is a, whatever that means exactly, simple, wholehearted person. Maybe that's a little bit ironic given Jacob's history, but he is a Yoshev Ohalim. He is a Yoshev Ohel, right? And therefore, Odo Shivcha Ohalim Kinei Moed, I wonder if it's also a reference to Jacob. I only say that because Jacob is mentioned explicitly in these Haftorah. So maybe. So in short, what I'm trying to just demonstrate this week, last week we spoke a lot about how this Haftorah may contain sort of critiques and specific types of readings of the Jacob story vis-a-vis Esav. Here I'm trying to focus on how the prophet evokes stories from Genesis, stories from Exodus, and in evoking all of these stories of, implicitly, but all these stories of exile, and near death, he's also evoking the possibility of return from exile, the possibility or precedent for return from near death, and that's how he chooses to speak to the people. That's how he chooses to speak to Ephraim, to the beloved son, at this time. So that is point number one. And I'll just say that we say that the prophets, which were recorded in Tanakh, had prophecy which is relevant for their times and Ladorot, for all time. So that's certainly, it's like exile is no sort of strange concept for the Jewish people in the literal sense. But I will also say that the notion of exile as a fundamental feature of existence, a core component of what it means to be a human being, existentially speaking, I think is very important. To me, it's part of the claim of the Eden stories, which is to say that wherever we find ourselves not where we might have been, and there's always that sense of distance from the garden. And that's why exile, these prophecies, both in the literal sense, have relevance, but also in if you want to call it a metaphorical or a different type of exilic sense, are also always resonant. Okay, that's number one. Let me stop screen share again so I can look at the chats. So here we have Sharon. Very interesting to think of as humans exiled from Eden. Humans are all on the hero's journey. Considering how much exile there is in the Torah and how the Torah begins with the human story with exile, I'm wondering why we don't have a narrative that says that the condition we are in is ideal and needs to be accepted, as opposed to this experience of pain, exile, death is not ideal, and there's a way to work out against. So that's really interesting, right? And I don't have an immediate answer. Are there, maybe what Sharon is saying, I think, is, It's interesting. Are there teachings? There's teachings about how to be in exile with the pushing towards and the hope for returning home, but are there teachings about how to be in exile and be there and thrive within there? There certainly are teachings, but how that exactly relates to, I mean, if indeed we can't get back to Eden, then the whole Torah is about how do you thrive in exile, right? Because we're all in the exilic sense. But and much of, you could argue much of rabbinic Judaism and Jewish history, which took place in the exile, is exactly a playing out of your core question, which is a really important one. Rumel, what do you got there? Wizard of Oz, say a little more. You're muted.
That's the whole story of the Wizard of Oz.
Which is to say,
exile and trying to get home.
Right. The question is, let's say you get stuck in Oz. Let's say there's no returning back to Kansas. So what then? What's the Torah of that? Okay. Sarich and Ruth says, sounds like a paraphrase of sitting in the sukkah because I had you dwell in Kibbutz Sukkot, right? Hoshafni Israel, right? Sometimes Ohalim, very good. Thank you. So the desert narratives. Okay, excellent. Okay, so this is the first focus of this morning. And again, I just want to say, I think that, you see that the Hosea speaking not only to people that has time, but, I think to potentially all people at all times have to wrestle with that, that question. Are we indeed in exile? And if so, what do we do about that? Okay, so point number 2, I just want to reference, I'll get into is, I'll go back to the screen share, is as follows. In the Haftorah, as I mentioned last week, and this week I'll say again, and this is the explicit reason why the Haftorah is brought for our Parashiyot. Jacob is the Jacob story is talked about, right? Is taught and interpreted by Hosea. But Beten, so this is in chapter 12. But Beten, I'm sorry, it's chapter 12 or chapter 12. But Beten al kavat achiv uve'ono Sarah et Elohim. Jacob, right, was tried to supplant his brother. I think Everett Fox says the name Jacob, he calls it a heel snatch. That's how he translates Jacob, because of akabat achiv, because he held on to the heel of his brother. So it's a play on the word Yaakov, or it's an etymology of his name. Uve'ono Sarah et Elohim. And in his strength, here they have grown to manhood, but when he reached his strength, as opposed to Babeten, Sarah et Elohim. He strove with Elohim. Here they translate Elohim as a divine being. Vayasar el melech vayuchal, bacha vayitchanen lo, Beit El yimsaenu, v'sham yidaber imanu. He strove with an angel. I'll translate how they translate here on JPS 85. He strove with an angel and prevailed, vayuchal. The other had to weep and implore him. Bacha vayitchanen lo. Beit El yimsaenu, at Beth El, Jacob would meet him. The Sham Yidaber Imanu, there to commune with him. Adonai Elohei Tzvaot, Adonai Zichro. Okay, so this is how the GPS translates. And this is referencing not only Beten Yachav Yachiv, the beginning of Jacob's story, but this week's Parashah. And I'll just change the screen for a second. In chapter 32 of Breshit, the passage of the mysterious figure who Jacob encounters by the river. So I'll remind us that Jacob has left Lavan's house and is re-entering the land, has encountered angels, and is fearful of his brother Esav. And right, he divides his flock, and he sends malachim of his own messengers to bring gifts to his brother, etc. Right, if I propitiate him with presents in advance and face him, fanav, achapra fanav. If I see his face thereafter, maybe he will show me favor. And he remained. The gift goes on. Behulan balalahu b'machaneh. He gets up. He crosses the river Yabok, sends across all of his possessions, and then vayevater, the famous, the celebrated passage, mysterious. Vayevater Yaakov livado. Jacob was left alone. The lonely man of faith. The Midrash actually associates, by the way, this in Bereshit Rabbah associates this verse with another verse about God. V'niskav Hashem levado bayomahu. That God will be levado on that great day, right? God will be alone among the powers that be, but the aloneness of Jacob and the aloneness of God are associated. Vayevater Yaakov levado. Yaakov is left alone. Vayavek ishimo ad alot hashachar. And Ish is Yavekito, right? Wrestles with him, struggles with him until the break of dawn. Vayar, Pilo Yacholo. And he saw that he could not overcome him, prevail against him. Vayiga bekaf Yericho. So he wrenched his hip at its socket. Vateka kaf Yerech Yaakov. And Jacob's hip was wrenched. Beheva koimo. When he wrestled with him. Vayomer shalcheni, ki Allah hashachar. So he says, release me, for dawn is breaking. Vayomer lo ashalecha ki berachtani. But he says, I will not let you go until you bless me. Vayomer elav ma shemecha. What is your name? Vayomer Yaakov. He says, my name is Jacob. Vayomer lo Yaakov ye'amerot shimcha ki Yisrael. You will now be called Yaakov, Yisrael. Hisarita and Elohim ve'im anashim vatuchal. Vayishal Yaakov, Vayomer Hagidena Shemecha. What's your name? And he says, Vayomer Lama zeh tishal shmi. Why should you ask my name? Vayivarech oto sham. And he blessed him there. Vayikra Yaakov Shem Akom Piniel. And Jesus says, this place will be called Piniel ki ra'iti Elohim panim al panim vatinatzel nafshi. For I have seen Elohim face to face, and my life has been preserved. The sun rises and he's limping. This is why Israel do not eat the gin hanasha until this very day. And then by Yaakov Einav, next thing we know, Jacob lifts up his eyes, Bayar, and he sees, behold, here comes Esau. Esau comes. And they greet each other. They kiss, and Jacob says, accept my gift from you. I'm summarizing. Because I have seen your face like one sees Pnei Elohim, and you have received me favorably. And the story goes on. So this is an amazing story, and has received much interpretation, starting with perhaps Hosea, starting with perhaps in our very Haftorah. And meditation, if you will, on the Jacob story, on the story of Jacob and the angel. And, Chulin 91 to 92. And I'll just note that, as I sort of I was trying to maintain ambiguity as I was reading, it's unclear in many moments in the story who is doing what, right? Who exactly could not, overcome who, right? Who touched whose thigh exactly? There's some element of ambiguity. Additionally, of course, there's the question of who is this Ish that Jacob is wrestling with. So again, Hosea calls it Elohim and a Malach. Who is this Ish? Who is a Malach? So, one possibility in the Midrash is that it is an angel indeed, but the angel of Esav. And I read this intentionally. One reason to think that maybe it's something to do with Esav is when Jacob eventually meets Esav, he evokes the language from his encounter with this Ish. He says, Ki alkein ra'iti fanecha kirot pnei Elohim vatirtzeni. Seeing your face is like seeing Pnei Elohim. Well, he just had such an experience, Pniel, right? Ra'iti panim al panim. So it sounds like Jacob himself is associating the two stories. And actually, when you read it, right, this Ish, figure eventually leaves, and then all of a sudden Jacob, behold, Jacob looks up and sees Esav. So it sounds like the Chumash itself is alluding to the association of the two passages, and midrashically, the way that it's expressed is that this Ish is none other than the Malach, the Sarosh Esav, Esav's ministering angel. Right? Everyone apparently has their own angel above. and this is actually Esav angel. But there's also, as you may know, readings that the one with whom Jacob is struggling is none other than, in a way, Jacob himself, Jacob's alter ego, and that Jacob's struggle, ultimately in this reading is ultimately, it's not with God and it's not with Esav. It's fundamentally, it's with himself and his. That's where really the hero's journey, comes into play. I think that one of the best pieces of evidence that this is Jacob fighting himself is the fact that they're locked in the stalemate, right? They just can't seem to overcome one or the other. Now, why is that exactly? Well, if you're fighting against yourself, then you're pretty much equipoised there. It's you against yourself. So it's hard to have somebody get the upper hand there. So that's another possible reading of Jacob, the hero on his journey and his struggle with himself, if not his struggle with this malach, this Elohim, perhaps this angel of Esav. But the Gemara in Chulin, I wanted to share with you in our closing minutes the following, has this whole meditation on this story, on Jacob. And here it says as follows, Vayomer shalcheni ki Allah hashachar. So remember that the angel says in our passage, this Ish, whoever this is, says, let me go, for the sun has risen. Now, what does B have to do with A? The fact that the sun has risen, why does that mean that he should let him go? So if it's like a night vision, I guess that would make sense. But the way the Gemara has it is as follows. Jacob says to him, what are you, a ganav? What are you, like a thief or a gambler? That's one way of reading this term. Kuveyustus, who's afraid of the dawn? You're some sort of night thief? Why do you care if it's the sun, the sun has come up? So Amar lo, no, malachani. Guess what? I'm a malach. It's interesting, right? Till then, apparently he didn't know who he was fighting. He says, no, I'm a malach. But and from the day I was created, my time to recite song in front of God has not arrived until right now. Today the sun has risen on me. Today is my day to recite Shirah. The commentators here debate the nuances of what exactly is going on here, but this is one reading, and therefore I got to go. I have to go praise God. Which, by the way, is an interesting idea that one way of reading this is that every angel has one particular day to recite Shirah. Right? So think about that for human beings. Everyone has their one day, right, to the day that they were created for, to recite their Shirah. So that's why he says let me go, and that's why in this reading, Jacob, right after he says Ki Allah hashachar. So once he says that, Jacob apparently says, oh, so you're not just some person, right? You're a malach. And that's why when you say Ki Allah hashachar, he says to him, no, you have to bless me, because now I realize that you are none other than an angel, which is how Hosea has it, right? You're an Elohim, you're a malach, you're this mighty figure. And what the Gemara goes on to do, interestingly, is talk about the difference between humans and angels. And the Gemara says here that this little notion that this angel has one particular day to recite a song, or the notion that angels in general recite songs, supports the teaching of Rav Chanan al-Nimerav, who says that every day there are three groups of angels, of Malachei HaSharet, who sing praise to God. One says Kadosh, the second says Kadosh, and the third says Kadosh Adonai Tzevaot. Kadosh, 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 Kadosh Adonai Tzevaot. Right, which is we know from our liturgy, from the Kedusha, from taken from the prophet Yeshaya. And there you see that the angels have songs. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, the angels, one of the angels gets to say Kadosh Hashem Tzevaot, but don't we know another text which says Chavivin Yisrael Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yoter Malachei HaSharet. The Jewish people are more dear to God than the ministering angels, because Israel says Shirah Bechol Sha'ah. Israel is constantly, or may constantly, say Shirah, but Malachei HaSharet Einom Shirah Lapam Achat Bayom. But angels can only say it once a day, or once a week, maybe, or some people say once a month, or once a year, or once every 7 years, or once every jubilee, one time in the world. The angels only get their one chance, but we human beings have, or Israel has the opportunity, all the time to say Shirah. And furthermore, when we reference God, we say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We reference God's name right away. Shema Yisrael Adonai, right away. After only two words, Shema Yisrael we can say God's name. Angels, it takes them 3 words to get there. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot. Right. So what is the point of it? So then they go on to harmonize, and they figure it out how to harmonize. And okay, maybe it's once they already said Kadosh, Kadosh, the other guys can say Kadosh, Adonai Tzevaot and get to God's name right away. But the point I just want to make here is that by investigating the relative strengths and relation between Israel and angels, the Gemara is elaborating on the story of Jacob fighting the angel. And the question, therefore, is, in this reading, and again, Hosea, our prophet from our Haftorah, is the one who explicitly says this is an angel we're dealing with here, is, it's about humans versus angels and their relationship. And that's a way of getting at, like, what does it mean to be human, right? Because angels have their merits, and they have what's great about them. But as the story and elsewhere in the Talmud says, they also don't get the Torah, right? So maybe they're never in exile, but they also don't get the Torah, which was given in the desert. And that's also what Jacob has for us, right? Jacob is the one who wrestles with the angel, and they're kind of equipoised. Wrestling with an angel, wrestling with the Esau's angel, wrestling with himself, but eventually he can overcome. But it's ambiguous and hard and full of strife. And I'll just close by sort of sourcing what I just said in the text of the Gemara, which cites our Haftorah. The Gemara says as follows: the Haftorah says, the prophet says, "Vayasar el malach vayuchal." He strove with an angel, and he overcame. And the Gemara says this passage is really ambiguous. I'm not sure, by the way, if we thought it was so ambiguous. Everyone here on the Zoom right now, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But the Gemara says it's really ambiguous because it says, "Eni yodeya mina asesar lami." When you read this verse, right? How would we know who won, who became a sar to whom? It's only by virtue of reading the source text in Breshit, Kishomer, Kisaritim Elohim, Vatzuchal, that you, and they're speaking to Jacob, Haviomer, Jacob Nasa Sar Lamalach. It must be Jacob who is the Sar Lamalach. Bachavet Chanenlo, he wept and made supplication to him. So, Eni Yodea, Mi Bachalami, who cried out to whom? We'll end in 1 minute. Who cried out? Who cried and who beseeched whom? Who made supplication to whom? I don't know. It's only by virtue of looking back at Genesis, Vayomer Shalcheni, when he says, release me. You see, it's the angel who's crying to Jacob, and Jacob was the one who wins. So the point that I would want to make here is that when the Gemara, reads the verse in our Haftorah about Hosea as being ambiguous, it's on the one, it's kind of highlighting the fact that. Or the claim, the position that we're really unclear who ultimately wins in this battle between humanity and the angels, right? Between humanity and whoever we're struggling with. In some deep way, it's equipoise. Ultimately, right, we can look at Genesis and realize that it's Jacob who overcomes, and it's the angel who cries and weeps. But from Hosea itself, it's not entirely clear. The notion of Israel as opposed to the angels is a general motif, but existentially, I'd say the idea of ourselves versus our own angels, and who can overcome whom is that is a continuous one, which is not going to be resolved so easily. Finally, to tie it back to Jacob and tie it back to exile, Ki sarita Elohim v'amanashim. So Rabbah teaches, when it says Sarita em Elohim ve'im anashim, so Remez Ramazlo Shatitim Shnei Sarim Asep Imenu. This intimates, right, the sort of double language, intimates that there'll be 2 future princes, Sarim, who will emerge from him. One, the Rosh Golah Sheba Bavel, and the second, Nasi Sheba Eretz Yisrael. There'll be 2 Sarim who will emerge from him, one, the exilarch in Babylonia, and the 2 Nasis in Israel. Mikan Ramaz Lo Galut. This is where he intimated to Jacob that there will be an exile. So Jacob was returning from exile. It is intimated back to him there will be another exile and another exile, because the struggle of exile will be continuous and manifold and perhaps even inherent to the human condition. That is the world we find ourselves in. Okay, thank you, everybody. To be continued next week, and please do consider joining us at the Winter Zman. Nice to learn with you as always.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, as always, for participating in our learning community. And we hope that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and be well.